لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. I welcome you back to our level 1 course in Shafi fiqh, Imam al-Hadrami's Safinat Al-Naja, covering ibadat from a Shafi'i primer, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. We commence from where we left off, alhamdulillah, with our course. Our course objectives is to introduce our students to Islamic law, to have a first step into the legacy of the Shafi'i school, and to learn the 5 pillars of Islam at a beginner level, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. This lesson, we will deal with the 17 integrals of prayer, therefore it being one of the most important lessons we learn in fiqh. And number 2, the description of the prayer itself from the beginning till the end, inshaAllah ta'ala. And thirdly, our 3 degrees of intention. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasizes the importance of salah throughout the Quran. And this starts from the very beginning of the Quran, wherein Allah Azza wa Jal says, الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ وَيُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ. Those who are Allah conscious are described as being believers in the unseen, establishers of the prayer, and they spend of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had provided them with. Now, in this course, in this lesson, bi'idhnillah, I said it's one of the most important lessons in fiqh because we cover the 17 integrals of the prayer. In a previous lesson, we emphasized the fact that one of the conditions of the prayer is that one does not confuse something that is fard for being sunnah and vice versa. The shortcut around that, of course, was to believe that the entire salah, as you learn it, as you practice it, is fard. But the more advanced version of that is to genuinely learn which components of the prayer are obligatory and which are highly emphasized and which are what we refer to as sunan, right? Regular, voluntary or supererogatory acts that are highly rewarded by Allah Azza wa Jal. So to graduate to that level, what we need to do is to learn the integrals of the prayer, thereby being able to emphasize our practice on those integrals and ensure that we do them to the best of our ability, and to know that we have confidently fulfilled the prayer by completing all of its shurut, its conditions, and its arkan. Then we know we have a sound prayer, it is valid according to sacred law. Of course, this is just the bare minimum, but in order to have a more thorough approach to the prayer, you need to have the baseline in order, you need to have the bare minimum in order, and thereafter you can focus on the extra or the supererogatory elements of the prayer to enhance one's rewards within the prayer. This is not a comment on the spiritual value of the prayer. It is essential for us to also develop our prayer spiritually. And for that, I would recommend starting with Bidayatul Hidayah of Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, the beginning of guidance. And then slowly as we manage to implement those fundamental spiritual elements, to incorporate more and more of that in our prayer. And ultimately it is towards attaining khushu, or humble submission within one's prayer, which is the spiritual quality that should be prevalent throughout our connection with Allah in salah. So with that said, our tartib as per normal is to deal with the text of Safinat Al-Naja, then translate the text, give some commentary on that, elaborate on it where necessary, and then provide you with the notes from a contemporary sharh. Namely, here we use Nailur Raja. So we'll proceed with that same tartib bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So the first discussion is on the integrals of the prayer. Bab fi arkani salah, or faslun fi arkani salah, a chapter regarding the integrals of the prayer. Arkanu salati sab'ata ashara. The integrals of the prayer are 7. There are 7 integrals of salah. And this, of course, there's some differences of opinion in terms of how to count them. You'll see as we proceed. But the most prevalent count in the Shafi'i school happens to be this, 17. Al-awwalu, the first integral of the prayer is an-niyyatu, the intention. As we know by now, in the Shafi'i school, the intention is part of every act of worship, and this is based predominantly on, number one, the ayah of the Quran, وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. They have not been commanded except to worship Allah, to serve Allah, sincerely devoting their religion for Him. But more importantly and more directly, on the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, probably one of the most oft-quoted hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Actions are according to their intentions. So for the Shafi'i school, an act of worship is not an act of worship unless it is accompanied by an intention, and we will elaborate on the exact meaning of that, the implications of that, and the various degrees of intention as we proceed bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So that's integral number one. Then there's also a discussion with some scholars as to whether the niyyah is part of the integrals of the prayer or the shurut of the prayer. And in order to understand this ikhtilaf, you have to understand what is the difference between a rukn, an integral, and a shart, a condition. To say that one is obligatory would be incorrect, because both the arkan as well as the shurut are necessary. They are obligatory for the validity of any act of worship. So if it's not that one is obligatory, then how do we define the difference? Both the arkan and the shurut are the pillars upon which the act of worship is built. The difference is that the shurut, the conditions, are those obligatory elements that exist outside of the act of worship itself, and the act of worship is dependent upon them to exist in order for the act of worship to take place. The arkan are the building blocks of the act of worship itself, meaning it's inside the act of worship. So the shurut lies outside of the actual act of ibadah, not forming part of the ibadah in the sense of the components of the ibadah, but the ibadah rests upon it. Whereas the arkan, the integrals, are the actual building blocks of the ibadah itself. To give you a worldly example of this, you can think about it in the sense of, before you build a house, there's certain things that needs to be done. The foundation needs to be solid, it needs to be laid, it needs to be according to standard, and only then can you build the house upon it. So in this example, the foundation would be one of the shurut, one of the conditions of building the house, but then building the house itself would consist of laying the bricks and laying the mortar and then building accordingly. So the scholars then differ, the niyyah being something that must be prevalent at the time of saying the first takbir or at the time of commencing the act of worship. Does it form as one of the preconditions of the prayer or one of the preconditions of ibadah, or is it part of the ibadah itself? So there's some semantical differences around that. What is agreed upon is that it is obligatory to have the intention. This is according to the Shafi'i school. And most Shafi'is count it as being part of the element of worship itself, because it must be present at the commencement of the act of worship. As in with the salah, the intention must be present at the time of saying Allahu Akbar, which is the takbiratul ihram. That would signify that it is in fact part of the act of worship, and therefore it must be counted as one of the integrals, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We move on to the second integral. As we just said, takbiratul ihram, it is the opening declaration that Allah is the greatest. So you say Allahu Akbar, Allah is the greatest. To start off the prayer, this statement is necessary, and this is a reference to the takbiratul ihram. Please note that when we say takbiratul ihram, there are other elements inclusive of this, meaning it consists also of the raising of the hands to a certain point and the placing of the hands on one's chest to a certain point. But that's not the takbiratul ihram, those are accompanying actions. The takbiratul ihram is the pronouncement of Allahu Akbar or Allahul Akbar, as we will soon come to learn. We move on to the next integral bi'idhnillah, which is number 3, al-thalithu, al-qiyamu, standing, ala al-qadiri, for the one who is able, fil fardi, specifically in the obligatory prayer. So standing is a condition, or rather an integral of the prayer, only applicable to those who can actually stand, and only applicable as an integral fil fardi in the obligatory acts of worship. So you can, in other words, omit the standing when it comes to a supererogatory prayer. So one can sit and pray a sunnah prayer, but a person who is able to stand cannot sit for a fard prayer. They have to stand for the fard prayer, and Allah knows best. Number 4, الرابع قراءة الفاتحة, the recitation of the Fatiha. In the Shafi'i school, there is no prayer that is valid, sunnah or fard, without the recitation of the Fatiha. This is because of the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, in which he states, لا صلاة إلا بفاتحة الكتاب. There is no prayer except with the Fatiha. And in the Shafi'i school, the interpretation and understanding of this hadith is that there is no valid prayer except that it must contain the recitation of Surah Al-Fatiha, and Allah knows best. That was number 4. We move on to number 5. Al-Khamisu, the 5th integral is Al-Ruku', the bowing. The bowing posture, when one's torso becomes parallel to the ground and you bend over, that is referred to as the Ruku'. Number 6, As-Sadisu, At-Tuma'ninatu fihi. At-Tuma'ninatu fihi, which means a stillness in it. A stillness in it. In it, يعني in the ruku. Now, you will notice that this concept requires a bit of explanation, because it's not an independent action, but rather it is an accompanying action or quality that belongs to other actions. And importantly, you would also notice that this phrase, at-tuma'ninatu fihi, appears as an integral again at number 8, again at number 10, again at number 12, and it appears again at number, just till number 12. So in other words, it is repeated throughout. So what is this at-tuma'ninatu, this stillness that must be present therein? To clarify, this is derived from a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in which a Sahabi prays salah, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he tells the Sahabi to repeat the prayer because he has not prayed. Now, for all intents and purposes, the Sahabi's actions were fine, right? He fulfilled the prayer as it was meant to be fulfilled. He did all of the actions. But from the context of the hadith, we understand that he prayed rapidly. So he would stand and he would then go into ruku, but immediately come up. And then immediately go down. So there was no stillness, there was no moment of pause in these actions. So the Prophet Muhammad repeatedly commanded the Sahabi to repeat his prayer, until he then taught the Sahabi that the prayer must have a moment of stillness in all of these postures. And from this hadith, the Shafi'i school had derived the fact that this stillness is a necessary element of these acts of worship. So the ruku and the i'tidal and the sujood and so forth, that yes, the action is required, but also a pause, right? So you cannot just go into ruku and come up, right? There has to be at least a moment of pause before moving on from that point. So this element, tuma'ninatu fihi, refers to a moment of stillness, a moment of calm. The fuqaha basically describe it as a moment in which all of one's limbs come to a complete rest, a complete pause, and it remains that way for a moment long enough to utter Subhanallah. Now, of course, this is a means of estimation. It's basically for a second, Subhanallah. You can say that in 1 second. But without such stillness for that amount of time, the act of worship there, whether it is the ruku or the sujood, etc., it would not be valid. So it is essential that we ensure you don't have to pray slowly, right? That's not a condition of the prayer or an integral of the prayer. But what is a condition, or rather what is an integral, is to at least have these moments of pause wherein our body comes to a complete rest, long enough to say Subhanallah. So that is what the tuma'nina refers to. And in each repetition thereof, it refers to the same thing, just within a different element of the prayer. So this first one, as in number 6, was a reference to the moment of stillness. Fihi, in the damiriya refers back to the last thing that was mentioned, which is the ruku. So there must be a moment of stillness in the ruku, in the bowing posture. The seventh integral is al-i'tidal, which is the rising up from the ruku. When one stands back up, you in the ruku, and then you say Sami Allahu liman hamida, and you stand back up. That position there is called the i'tidal. That is an integral of the prayer. But as we said, being an integral is the one aspect, and then having a moment of stillness is the other aspect. So he says then, الثامن, the eighth integral is الطمأنينة فيه, a moment of stillness therein. التاسع, number 9, السجود مرتين. السجود, the prostration, مرتين, twice. So to prostrate twice is the 9th integral of the prayer. And then again, number 10, العاشر, number 10, الطمأنينة فيه, to have a moment of stillness therein as well. We proceed to the next one, الحادي عشر, number 11, الجلوس بين السجدتين. الجلوس, sitting, between السجدتين, between the two prostrations. So number 10 we spoke about, or rather number 9 we spoke about the two prostrations. So we know that in our prayer we go down onto the ground with our foreheads. We place our limbs on the ground. So we will mention exactly what needs to be placed on the ground. But that must happen twice. And in both prostrations, there must be a moment of stillness, as well as in the sitting between the two prostrations, there must be a moment of stillness therein as well, which was the 12th integral. We proceed from there. الثالث عشرة, the 13th integral is التشهد الأخير, the final tashahhud, meaning the final tashahhud, the position that we sit in to recite التحيات لله المباركات الصلوات, and then we end the prayer. The final sitting for that is an integral. Now, of course, here you can notice that the first sitting after the second raka'ah in a 4 raka'at prayer, that sitting is not mentioned, which means that it is not an integral. That sitting is regarded as an emphasized sunnah or a ba'd, right? An emphasized sunnah. We'll speak about those later on. As what is important now is to learn the integrals. So that was number 13. We proceed to number 14, الرابع عشرة, number 14, القعود فيه, to sit in it. So the tashahhud that we just spoke about, the final tashahhud, that is an integral. And then as a separate integral, sitting for the tashahhud is another integral. Okay, that's counted separately. So in other words, the tashahhud itself is in reference to the recitation, right? The tahiyyat, the shahada, and the salawat. Whereas the qu'ud part, the sitting part in number 14, this is a reference to how we should be positioned for when we conduct that recitation. Al-Khamisa Ashar, the 15th integral, As-Salatu ala Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam fihi. The salutations, the praise upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in it, in other words, in the final tashahhud. So the prayer, one of the integrals of the prayer, as in number 15, is that we recite a prayer upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the bare minimum of which is to say, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. And that there is an integral of the prayer, meaning that at the least we need to say a formula of salawat upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in order for our prayer to be valid. If we don't so much as say one salutation upon him, alayhi salatu wasalam, the prayer would not be valid. Now, only up until that point is considered an integral. The extras, in other words, which formula of salawat we employ, that isn't an integral, that is a sunnah. And the extras as in sending salawat upon his family, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that too isn't an integral, it is part of the emphasized sunan, but we'll elaborate on that later. So as you can see, what is important in fiqh is that when our fuqaha delineate a particular area and says that this area is the shurut, then we need to learn it as such because they would be the only shurut. Then they would elaborate what is the arkan, what are the integrals that make up this ibadah. We need to learn that because they would be the only integrals. So once you know that the shurut and the arkan are fulfilled, then you know that the act of worship, inshaAllah ta'ala, is valid. Beyond that, would be sunnahs and the like. So once you have a clear understanding of the various limitations of these definitions or what they refer to, one can pray, one can worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with more confidence. And what you would also notice is that this dispels many misunderstandings about the acts of worship. So if anybody has a question, is my prayer valid if I leave out this? Is my prayer valid if I do that? Is my prayer valid if I don't say this? Is my prayer valid if I don't add that? Etc. All of those questions. And there are, of course, probably an infinite number of possibilities, right? Or at least there's a large number of possibilities as to these questions. But by learning in the way that our fiqh is structured, it would basically dispel all of those concerns, and you end up with confidence in your worship, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So that brings us all the way up till number 15, and that means we have 2 integrals remaining, and there are as-sadisa ashara, number 16, as-salam, which is the greeting to one's right, saying assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Only the first one being an integral and the second one being a sunnah. So this refers to the first taslim, the first greeting towards one's right hand side. And then the final integral is as-sabi'a ashara, number 17, at-tartib, the sequence, right? The Shafi'i school in matters of worship often resorts to the principle ibda'u bima bada Allahu bi, begin with what Allah Ta'ala had begun with, which is why the tartib often plays a significant role, as in the validity of the wudu. The tartib, or the sequence of the wudu, must be in order of the limbs that Allah Ta'ala mentions in the Quran. And that is why it remains an integral for the wudu for the Shafi'i school. Now what do we do? What we've just done is give a basic run through of the 17 arkan of salah, with the intention of simply clarifying what is this referring to, what is each one referring to, and a little bit of information about it. What is required of us as students at this point is to, number 1, memorize this list. So to the point where you are able to write down 17 numbers, and next to each number have the word as it is here, whether in Arabic or English, depending on your intention for further studies. I would recommend both. To then be able to have this entire list and dedicate that to memory. The easiest way to go about this is to go through the prayer itself in practical demonstration, and as you go through the prayer, make a mental note with the list in front of you. So you're not really praying, you are going through the practical actions of the prayer. And for each action that you do, check the list. Is this one of the integrals? Is this one of the integrals? And if it's not one of the integrals, it already answers your question, right? In other words, if it's not on the list in front of you, then it already answers your question about whether this action is one of the integrals or not. As an example, as we learn now, you will come to understand the meaning and the context and the details of each of these 17 points. So as you do your practical demonstration and you say Allahu Akbar, and you have the niyyah, and then you start reciting, and then you reach the opening supplication, Inni wajahtu wajhiya lilladhi fatra samawati wal ard. Now you ask yourself, okay, is this opening supplication on the list of integrals? And I look at my list and I see, well, no, it doesn't appear here at all. So therefore, the opening supplication is clearly not one of the integrals of the prayer. The idea behind this is not so that we can now say, well, okay, I'm not going to do the opening supplication anymore, so I'll cross that out. That's not the idea whatsoever. The idea here is I need to understand what the baseline is for my prayer, what the bare minimum foundation is for my prayer, upon which I will then build the rest of the elements of the prayer. This allows one to prioritize one's focus and one's attention in the prayer. So as an example, a person who dedicates himself to slowly and meticulously recite the opening supplication, that's good. Inni wajjahtu wajhiya lilladhi fatara samawati wal ard, and they think about it and they contemplate it and they say it meticulously. But then when they reach the Fatiha, they rush through it. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, alhamdulillah bil alamin. That would be incorrect. From 2 perspectives. Number 1, that recitation of the Fatiha wouldn't be valid. But number 2, you would also understand that, look, this is an integral of the prayer. I must give my focus to this. Without this, the prayer is invalid. And therefore, I'm going to try to, if I'm going to focus more on some things than other things, ideally I should focus on everything and be reflective and present with everything. But if I am only able to concentrate with certain elements, then I know which elements to choose. Furthermore, if I find myself in a situation where I'm unable to pray as I would like to pray, I'm unable to pray as I should pray, fulfilling all of the arkan and shurut and sunan, and I'm only able to pray 4 rak'at to fulfill the salah because I'm in a situation where I'm pressed for time and I'm unable to make any sort of alternative arrangements, then I know what do I need to do in order to fulfill my prayer. If I don't have this knowledge, I may be spending time on doing everything perfectly, and then I end up not being able to really have a fulfilling prayer. Whereas if I'm able to understand what the minimum is and I focus my attention on that, I may be able to fulfill 4 rak'at with full confidence that I've prayed soundly, validly, and still be accommodating for whatever pressures that I may have. Of course, this shouldn't be the norm. We should always try to pray to the best of our ability under all circumstances, but we don't always have the control over that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So those are the 7 integrals of the prayer. Our job now is to memorize them and learn them well. But before we can do that, we also need to thoroughly understand what each integral consists of, what are the details thereof, and how we can practically implement them, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So with that, we proceed to the translation of these integrals. The first one we said is the intention. What is most important to understand here is that an-niyya mahalluha al-qalb. The place of the intention is the heart. So what is important here is that you understand that the niyyah is not what is uttered. The essence of the niyyah is what is in the heart, in other words, what is on one's mind and in one's thoughts. So if there's a disparity between what's on your heart and mind and what comes out on your tongue, then you understand which is the area of focus. In other words, if I'm supposed to be praying dhuhr, and in my utterance of the niyyah, I say that I'm intending to pray dhuhr, but in my heart, I'm thinking that I'm praying asr. So I just slipped in my tongue because perhaps I used Arabic and I don't understand it. So I said dhuhr, I'm supposed to be praying dhuhr, but I'm thinking that I'm praying asr. Is that valid? No, that's not valid, because what matters is what's in the heart. So mahalluha, the place of the niyyah, is in the heart. And beyond that, the Shafi'i school generally gives us an encouragement that talaffuz biha, to utter the wording, to give a verbal expression to what is in one's heart, is sunnah. It is recommended. Now, this is a recommendation. So if we can manage to utter something that would remind our hearts and our minds of what it is we are doing, so we have an acute consciousness of purpose, which is the definition of a niyyah, acute consciousness of purpose, then that's good. But if there's a disparity between what we say and what we believe or what we think, then what matters is what we have in our hearts and on our minds. And then there's no consideration given to what we said with our tongues. So in other words, if a person is supposed to be praying dhuhr, in their hearts, they believe they're praying dhuhr. They thought, okay, I'm praying dhuhr, and they said, Allahu Akbar. But the intention that came out on their tongue was, nawaitu an usalliya fard as-salat al-asr. Then what they said wouldn't impact the validity of their prayer, because they knew they were praying dhuhr, they intended dhuhr, they just mistakenly said something else. So that's just to give some clarification on the niyyah. On top of that, if somebody prays with an intention, but they utter nothing, they don't say a thing, they just say Allahu Akbar with the full intention present in the heart, fulfilling all of the conditions of the intention as we will see, then that is also still valid, because talaffuz, to express the verbal intention, that is a recommendation, that is not one of the integrals, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So you can see also the same thing is mentioned in the footnotes. Now I won't be going through all the footnotes because it's quite extensive. Instead, I'll just incorporate the explanation within my own explanation, inshallah. But here in footnote number 14, he says to make intention in the heart is wajib and mustahab to utter it with the tongue. The intention should be simultaneous with the takbiratul ihram and remains till the completion of the takbir. So this is an important point because he's speaking here about where the intention should be. According to our fiqh, the intention should start as we commence the takbiratul ihram. So the moment I start with the of Allahu Akbar, that's when the intention should be in my heart. It must start, or it must be there in my heart when I say for Allahu Akbar, and I must remain acutely aware of my purpose till I'm completed with the Ra of Akbar. Allahu Akbar, for that entire duration, I need to be acutely conscious of what it is that I am fulfilling. And if there's a lapse in judgment, if there's a moment of I wasn't sure what it is that I was saying or doing, or during the Allahu Akbar, only then did I realize, oh yes, it's dhuhr. Then in all of those instances, it wouldn't be valid. It must be present as an acute awareness of one's objective from the very beginning of the Takbiratul Ihram till the very end. Meaning also that if by the end of the Fatiha, if somebody were to come and ask me, of course this is a hypothetical because you can't speak in Salah, but if somebody were to come and ask me, what prayer are you busy with? I may be so engrossed in my recitation of the Fatiha or in reflection that I'm unaware that I'm praying a particular Salah, that I'm praying Dhuhr or Asr. But that's okay, because the point of the niyyah is that you have acute consciousness of purpose at the time of commencing the action. Allah Azza wa Jal, He created us, He knows that our minds, they float about. We are not able to concentrate for extended periods of time and ultra focus always. So for the very least, at the commencement of the act of worship, that's when the intention matters. And then throughout the act, it's good to be aware. It's great to be aware. We should be aware of exactly what we are doing. But any sort of lapse in judgment or any moment of heedlessness or unmindfulness or distraction would not affect the validity of our prayer as long as our intention accompanied the Takbiratul Ihram at the beginning. And that's the paradigm that the Shafi'i school puts forward for intentions in every act of worship, and Allah knows best. Of course, it depends on the act of worship. It would differ as to how long the intention needs to be present, but it's always at the commencement of the act of worship. We spoke about the Takbiratul Ihram, the opening statement of Allahu Akbar. It must be in those words, Allahu Akbar. The only other acceptable form is Allahul Akbar. So the Takbiratul Ihram can only be in Arabic with the word Allahu Akbar or Allahul Akbar, as in Allah al-Akbar, right? Those two are valid. The minimal valid audibility, in other words, how loud should we say the Takbiratul Ihram? It can be heard through normal hearing under normal circumstances. That's important there. When we say the Takbiratul Ihram, Allahu Akbar, one cannot say this silently without any words whatsoever. And this is a problem that I often see people who pray by themselves. They sometimes, you can see in their actions, they would just do this. Obviously uttering in their minds, right, silently, they would be verbalizing the takbir. So according to the Shafi'i school, this is not valid. You have to have verbalization and audibility. Now, you don't have to have audibility to the point where everyone can hear you. The minimal audibility of the Allahu Akbar is that under normal circumstances, with average hearing ability, one would be able to hear one's own words. That means that if my hearing is sound and I'm not in a situation where the audio is somewhat disrupted, I'm not in an anechoic chamber where no audio bounces around, nor am I in a hall where, there's so much echo around that I can't hear myself, nor am I in a crowded street or a crowded room or crowded area where there's so much background noise that I can't hear myself. Those are unusual audio circumstances. But under normal circumstances, with normal hearing ability, I must be able to hear my own words. So, Allahu Akbar. Or even a whisper, Allahu Akbar, would be sufficient. But that's important to understand that there has to be a verbalization of the Takbiratul Ihram, and the same thing applies with recitation in other circumstances, whether that be the recitation of the Fatiha, whether that be the recitation of the Quran outside of Salah. When it comes to valid recitation as a form of worship, then according to the Shafi'i school, for the very least, under normal circumstances, with a usual hearing ability, one needs to be able to hear oneself, and Allah knows best. So if you didn't know that, that's an important lesson to solidify, inshaAllah ta'ala. Of course, in terms of the recommendation for how the Takbiratul Ihram should take place, it is recommended that one begins with the hands on one's sides, and the moment you start with the expression Allahu Akbar, to then start lifting the hands. So say Allahu Akbar, and that the movement of the hands accompany the entire Takbiratul Ihram, so that by the time one ends with the Ra of Allahu Akbar, then one's hands would be in place, ready for the Salah to commence. So the action accompanies the statement, and the same thing applies throughout the Salah. When you say Allahu Akbar to go into ruku', that you start as you go into ruku', and by the time you end the Allahu Akbar, then you are in your ruku' in the position that you are supposed to be in. The same goes with Sami Allahu liman hamida, the same goes with Allahu Akbar to go into sujood, and so forth. So ideally, your expression of the takbir should accompany the action that you are doing, and it should extend so that it encompasses the entire action accordingly, and Allah knows best. So we proceed then to number 3, the standing in the fard salah for those who have the ability. Again, an important point, that if it's a fard salah, you have to stand if you are able to stand. Whether you are traveling, whether you are on an airplane, a boat, a train, whether you are on land, sea, or in the air, if you can stand, then you must stand if it's a fard salah. If it's a sunnah salah, whether you are able to stand or not, you may pray seated, you may pray lying down, as we will come to discover. But standing is an integral of the fard prayer for those who are able to stand, and Allah knows best. Number 4, the recitation of the Fatiha. As I said, in the Shafi'i school, the recitation of the Fatiha is an integral for every salah, for every raka'ah. There is no validity of the prayer without the recitation of the Fatiha. And in our footnote number 17 here, Surah Al-Fatiha can be recited from memory or by looking into the Mus'haf, into the Quran. It is wajib to recite it in every rak'ah of the prayer, whether loudly or silently, whether an imam, a follower, or alone. So meaning, for the daytime prayers, Dhuhr and Asr, we pray silently. Still, you must recite the Fatiha, and still it needs to be to the level of audibility that we described before. In the louder prayers, Fajr, Maghrib, and Isha, where we recite audibly, again, still you need to recite the Fatiha. Whether it's Sunnah, whether it's Fard, always the Fatiha must be recited. And the reason for mentioning reciting from the Mus'haf, there's some ikhtilaf between the madhahib and the scholars about this issue, because of the movement that it may entail. However, the position of the Shafi'i school is that you can recite looking into the Mus'haf. This is especially useful for a beginner or somebody who had recently embraced Islam, to be able to follow some sort of guideline for the entire prayer, and especially for the obligatory elements such as the recitation of the Fatiha. That leads us to the ruku, the bowing. What is important in the bowing is the physical position of the bowing itself. So the best method is to raise one's hands and say Allahu Akbar, so that the person begins raising the hands as he starts the takbir, and when the hands are at shoulder level, he then bows. It is mustahab to prolong the words of the takbir until one reaches the next posture in every takbir, so that no part of the salah is without dhikr. That's what I've explained earlier. And that you also now receive the wisdom thereof, so that no part of the salah is without dhikr. Thereafter, the hands are placed on the knees, fingers apart, with back and neck extended, legs straight and elbows out, although women keep them close by, as that's more modest. And then one recites the tasbih 3 times. Now, again, we're speaking here about the integrals, so it's important to differentiate. The bowing is when one is standing and then you say Allahu Akbar and you go into the bowing posture. That's what is an integral here. The other elements about raising the hands, saying Allahu Akbar, yeah, because that's not an integral, and the tasbih, right, saying Subhana Rabbi al-Azim, or any of the other tasbihat that comes from the Sunnah, those are not integrals, right? So in other words, a person can do a ruku without saying a word. You can go from standing into ruku without saying Allahu Akbar, without saying the tasbih, without raising the hands at all. It would be valid. It's not ideal because those are all sunnah elements and you want to have as much of the sunnah in your salah as possible, but it would be valid. This is also useful for the person who perhaps makes salah and slips and doesn't say the Allahu Akbar to go into ruku. Not intentionally, they just forgot. And then they worried, is my salah valid because I didn't say Allahu Akbar when I went into ruku? Should I re-perform my salah? What should I do? And the answer is, my salah is valid because the saying of Allahu Akbar to go into ruku is not an integral. It is only an integral when I start the salah, and that would be the takbiratul ihram, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So that was in terms of the ruku. Then of course we said another integral is to remain motionless for a moment therein. Now I've explained that before, the tuma'nina, so we won't explain that one again. That was number 6. Number 7, the i'tidal, straightening up after the ruku. The i'tidal is to return to the posture one was in before the ruku, whether one was standing or sitting. It is wajib to intend nothing by one's movement except i'tidal. That there is a reference to the following. If a person prays a sunnah salah, then you can pray seated. And if you pray seated and you go into ruku, then of course i'tidal would mean you come back up into the position of sitting that you were in before you went into the ruku. For the person who is standing, when they go into ruku, then they are standing, and then when they come back up from the ruku, they are standing again. So that's essentially what the i'tidal is in reference to. And in terms of the other point that was mentioned, that it is wajib to intend nothing by one's movement except i'tidal, this is if you find yourself in a situation where for some reason or the other you jolt up, right? You jolt up from the ruku. The example that I use is you in ruku, and then on the ground before you see a scorpion or a snake or a spider or something, and it gives you such a fright that you jump up out of ruku back into i'tidal, and then you realize, okay, I am in i'tidal. I was supposed to come back into i'tidal, so inshallah I'll just continue from here. No, that would not be valid because you must only come up into i'tidal because of i'tidal, not for some other reason, right? And I know it's a theoretical or hypothetical situation, but there's a plethora of other possibilities that may be the impetus for you to have come up without actually intending to come up for i'tidal, in which case one would go back to the position that one was in and then come up specifically for the i'tidal, and Allah knows best. Number 8, remaining motionless for a moment therein, we've understood that. The 2 sajdas, the 2 sujuds, that's footnote number 20, which says in every raka'ah there must be 2 sujuds. Now, how does the sujud work? The sujud is when 7 limbs are on the ground. It's the palms of one's hands, it's the forehead, the nose is not necessary in the Shafi'i school, but because it is in the Hanafi school, you should try to have your nose on the ground as well. And then the knees, right? And the bottoms of one's toes. So the toes should be pointed forward with the bottoms of one's toes on the ground. And that's essentially it makes the 7 limbs of sajda. And the moment of stillness therein as well, that is not a recommendation, but an integral for the 2 sajdas, remaining motionless for a moment therein. Number 13, reciting the tashahhud at the end of the salah, the entire tashahhud, the tahiyyat, the shahada, and a brief salawat on the Prophet ﷺ at minimal. That would be the tashahhud. Then sitting for it is a separate integral. The salawat upon the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, of course, ideally, we want to recite the salawat al-Ibrahimiyyah, which is what the Prophet ﷺ actually recommended, which is Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammadin kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim ila akhir. That is the recommended tashahhud. But it's important to note that for a new Muslim, they may not have memorized it, they may not have learned it yet. And in such an instance, they may just suffice with at least a minimal formula of salawat, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin, sallallahu ala Muhammad, etc. So that's the salawat upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We will learn later on that you should ideally add prayers upon his family therein also, but that's not an integral. Then next is the salam. Number 16 is the salam. Footnote number 22 elaborates ending the salah with salam. Someone who is not a masbook, meaning a latecomer, to a jama'ah, may sit as long as he wishes after the imam's salam to supplicate, finishing with his own salam whenever he wishes. I think that's an important point. I don't think many people are aware of this, Shafi'i followers at least, that when you're praying with an imam, if you started the prayer with the imam and the imam ends his salam, so the imam says assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, but you're a follower, you are not obliged to end your prayer when the imam ends his prayer, because the moment he ends his prayer, then the connection between the two of you has now broken. Now, why would you want to extend your salam beyond what the imam does? In other words, why would you want to continue sitting in salah and not end your salah yet? Well, simply put, at the end of one's prayer, before saying salam, this is one of the mustajab times of praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's important to take advantage of that because it is praying inside of salah. So if you have dua to make, then you don't have to wait till the salah is over and you then specifically make dua. It's fine, you can do that, but it is even more impactful and more efficacious to have that prayer inside the salah itself, because then it's dua that was made inside of salah. So for that reason, the imam can end his prayer and you may continue seated and continue supplicating to Allah. And then when you are ready to end your prayer, to then say assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Now, when you have instances such as this, where it is not common knowledge, especially concerning your own culture, like I'm speaking from the perspective of my own culture, I see people in jama'ah and I notice that practically nobody would delay their salam beyond the imam. So when the imam ends his salah, everybody ends their salah also. That's the norm, that's fine. But that also indicates that it is not common knowledge. So when practicing something that is a legitimate part of the Sharia, but it is not common knowledge within your culture, take that into consideration when applying the rule and do so with wisdom. Because the objective of learning is not to demonstrate that you know things that other people don't know, especially when this may lead to confusion or even to dispute. Instead, apply wisdom in relation to this. Don't act on something unnecessarily or just for the sake of showing up and showing others that this is something that you know, but instead do so subtly. Do so subtly where you don't cause any issues thereby. Again, this is not a means of compromising and saying, well, break the rules of Allah because you need to appease others. By no means. But in matters where you are speaking about you have options, right? Then try to opt for the wiser option most of the time where you are able to do so, and Allah knows best. And then finally, to follow the sequence of the above integral postures of salah. So the tartib must be in order. Of course, the tartib is naturally going to be in order if you follow the regular sequence of the salah. So it's not something that you have to specifically be conscious of, did I do everything in order? Because by following the general order of the salah, these are going to be in order. So again, as I said previously, what is required of you now, with a brief explanation of each of these points, is to ensure that you've memorized these 17 arkan to the best of your ability, and to commit them to memory so that you are confident in your fulfillment of them bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So as is our norm, we have here the sharh, right, the exegesis of the same section from Nailur Raja. In essence, it explains exactly what we've explained. There are perhaps one or two points that are mentioned in addition to that, and therefore it's quite extensive. But the idea here is not to go through these notes in class, but rather to provide them to you if you are registered for the course, so that you may go through them as you find comfortable bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. What we want to go on to now, inshallah, is a note on the brief description of the prayer. So there's just a basic read through of these notes, and what it allows for us is to take those 7 integrals, which are they are a framework, right? If you only do those integrals, you're going to feel you'll notice if you try this at home, if you pray even 2 raka'at, sunnah salah, just to demonstrate to yourself what the integrals of the prayer are, by doing only the integrals and nothing else, you would notice that the form of the prayer doesn't feel quite right. And what I mean thereby is, imagine you're praying, you don't utter anything. The first thing you utter is Allahu Akbar. You only recite the Fatiha, so no ta'awudh, no opening dua. You don't recite Ameen. You don't recite the surah after the Fatiha. You don't say Allahu Akbar to go into ruku. You just go into ruku. You don't say Sami Allahu liman hamida. In ruku, you don't say any tasbih. You don't say Sami Allahu liman hamida. You just come up from ruku. You don't say Rabbana lakal hamd. You just remain, motionless for a moment. And then you just go down into sajda. You don't say Allahu Akbar. You don't recite any tasbihat therein. You just remain motionless for a moment. And so on and so forth till the end. You would notice that the prayer feels very different. It feels very empty. Now, there's different aspects to this. The one is, it's something that you're unfamiliar with because you probably haven't prayed like that before. And, this type of, there's a saying in Arabic that says, "An-nasu aduwwu lima jahilu." People are scared, or there's enmity for what they don't know. So you have to break that barrier. But then obviously there's also the spiritual element that if you deliberately omit all of these spiritual acts of worship that was institutionalized by Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam for our benefit so that we can gain reward, then naturally if you omit all of that, then you're going to have a prayer that's very empty of reward, that's basically only being done to fulfill your duty, right? It's not, I'm here because I want to be here, I'm here because I want to benefit, I'm just here because I need to get this thing out of the way. Now, I'm not encouraging this, I'm simply saying that you need to have that baseline, you need to know that baseline and be confident in it before you become confused about the other elements of the prayer. But it also teaches us the lesson of the value of the sunnah and the ridiculousness of somebody saying that something is only a sunnah, right? And sometimes we fall into this type of statement subconsciously. So we don't deliberately leave something out because it's a sunnah, but we may end up leaving something out with the impression that this isn't necessary, it's a sunnah, so I can omit it. Then if you've had this experience that I just described, you'd remember that if I were to have this attitude for my worship with Allah throughout, this is just a sunnah, that's just a sunnah, okay, I don't need to do this, it's a sunnah, I can do this because it's makruh, I can do that because it's makruh, you will understand what will happen to your heart eventually, right? It's a very cold way of approaching your acts of worship, and Allah knows best. So the following notes is here to add meat to the framework that we've given. This is not from Safinat Al-Naja, so I won't be going through them in detail with you, but it is there for you to understand the other elements of the prayer that go around the integrals and that make it far more substantial for you, bi'idhnillah. So here you have it. A note on the description of the salah, the sunnahs before commencing the salah. So those are the things that you need to have as sunnah before the salah commences. Upon commencing the salah, so the entire description of the takbiratul ihram, the opening supplication, the ta'awudh, the fatiha, the saying of ameen, what to do after the fatiha, if there's an imam or if one is praying alone. Then the surah after the fatiha with recommendations on what to recite. Then making ruku, then making i'tidal, then making the sajda. But of course here in all of the recommendations are here as well. So what to recite and so forth, right? And then at the end, before one raises, or rather when one raises one's head and sits before prostrating a second time, that's there. And then it carries on. So the second prostration, the way to sit in between the two prostrations is here. What to recite in between the two prostrations is here. What to do if your salah exceeds 2 raka'at. The sitting in the middle of the salah, meaning the first tahiyyah is mentioned here. the sitting in the last position, the style of tawarruk is mentioned here, and then closing the salah with the final salam, is mentioned here. Again, this is not part of Safinat Al-Naja, but it will assist you in making sense of the integrals that we just mentioned. Then there's an important point here in this slide that says it is mustahab to make dhikr and dua silently after the prayer. That's the official view in the Shafi'i school. Imam Shafi'i mentioned in Kitab al-Umm, I prefer that the Imam and the follower make dhikr after the salam and that they do so silently unless the Imam wants to be learned from, in which case he says the dhikr out loud until he believes that the congregation has learned from him, after which he will say it silently. The Imam turns for dhikr and dua so that his right side is towards the jama'ah and his left side towards the qibla. He leaves his place as soon as he finishes, and if there are no women, in which case he leaves or he waits for them to leave first. It is mustahab for the follower to remain seated until the Imam stands. So there's a lot of debate that goes around every so now and then about whether making dua and dhikr after the salah is a bid'ah or not. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of that, but what we can see here is the position of the Shafi'i school is that the sunnah is for everyone to make their own dhikr and to make their own dua. Culturally, of course, we know that in most places, Muslims pray in congregation. They would also add some adhkar afterwards, some dua afterwards. In my humble opinion, this is completely fine, because if we don't have this, then what you end up with is people just leaving, right? It's fine. But still, we should work towards the ideal that Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, explains, because that is the sunnah and the sunnah is the best. So have the congregation, perhaps every now and then, for the sake of newcomers, for the sake of children, etc., have them still continue with the group recitation, the group dhikr, the group dua, but also allow opportunities for those who want to fulfill the sunnah in the best way to have their own silent application, their own silent adhkar, even just by reminding the jama'ah. So the Imam can turn around and say, right, brothers, let's all engage in dua and supplication and dhikr, because that is the sunnah now, and let's do so silently. If you just leave it blank with the idea that everybody would resort to the sunnah, unfortunately, due to a lack of education or due to unawareness or just unmindfulness, making light of the situation, most people would end up leaving without any dua, without any dhikr, and that is unfortunate, even though it is not obligatory, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Tamam, we proceed inshallah to the final section, which is about the intention. Now, technically, we've covered this already, so we'll just run through the text because I've explained the details of the niyyah as it is. The niyyah is, fi niyyati salah, specifically the intention of the prayer. An-niyyatu thalathu darajatin. Niyyah, an intention, has three darajatin, 3 levels. In kanat as-salatu fardan. If the prayer is an obligation, if it's one of the 5 obligatory prayers, wajaba qasdul fi'l, then it is necessary to intend the action itself. What ta'yin, the specification, in other words, which prayer is it? Is it Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha? That must be specified. Wal fardiyyah, as well as the fact that it is obligatory. Those are the 3 elements that must be intended. I'm praying Salah, I'm praying Dhuhr Salah, and I'm praying the Fard of Dhuhr Salah. Those are the elements. وَإِن كَانَتْ نَافِلَةً, if it is a supererogatory prayer, mu'aqqatatan, that has a prescribed time. For example, duha, ishraq, and possibly awabin, right? Ka ratibatin, or like a ratiba, the sunnah prayers that accompany the obligatory prayer. أو ذات سبب, or it is a sunnah prayer that has a cause, it has a preceding cause. In these instances, what would have a preceding cause? Tahiyyat al-wudu has a preceding cause. Tahiyyat al-masjid has a preceding cause. وَجَبَ قَصْدُ الْفِعْلِ. In these instances, it is necessary to intend prayer, وَالتَّعْيِين, and also which prayer. Right? So you intend prayer and you also intend which prayer it is that you are praying. So if it is the 2 sunnahs before dhuhr, then I'm praying the 2 sunnahs before dhuhr. وَإِن كَانَتْ نَافِلَةً مُطْلَقَةً, if it is an unrestricted supererogatory prayer. There's no specific time attached to it. There's no specific sabab or cause attached to it. Then wajaba qasdul fi'al faqat. Then all one needs to intend is, I'm praying salah. So for example, salatul haja, I have a need, or salatul tawbah, I want to repent to Allah. There's no specific salah or a different type of salah or time for that salah that I need to have. I'm just going to pray. So at that point, all one needs to have as an intention is, I intend to pray, and then start the prayer. Al-fi'al, the action is usalli, I'm praying. That's the action, I'm intending to pray. What ta'yin, specification is dhuhran asran, which prayer am I praying? Wal fardiyya, the obligatory nature of the prayer is to simply intend fardan. Now these elements, when it comes to the niyyah in the Shafi'i texts, you will find that there's generally a formula that is attached to this, taking these matters into consideration. So you will find a formula, for example, that says nawaitu an usalliya fard as-salat al-dhuhri arba'a raka'atin mustaqbil al-qiblati ada'an jama'atan lillahi ta'ala, as an example. This is a comprehensive verbal expression of the prayer. If you understand what it says, and it would assist you to concentrate and to be conscious of your intention, then fabiha wa na'imat, bismillah, pray, it's fine, you can use that. What I find in the Western world though is that many Muslims, they have the impression, Shafi'i Muslims that is, they have this impression that this is the niyyah. This formula, this utterance is the niyyah. So I have to learn this. I have to commit this to memory, and I have to say this because I've heard that salah without an intention isn't valid. Now this is a mixture of facts and fiction. The fact is, you're right, salah without the niyyah isn't valid. But the fiction is that this is the niyyah. That is incorrect. This is a verbal expression of the niyyah. This line, this formula, nawaitu an usalliya fard as-salat al-dhuhr, mathalan, that is a expression of the niyyah, and that is not required for the prayer to be valid, right? So that's important. Now, why I'm saying this is not to discourage people from using these formulae. The scholars have composed them to assist us, right? So that your tongue can assist your heart to focus. However, the reason I'm emphasizing this is I find that many English-speaking or non-Arab-speaking Muslims, they emphasize this to the degree that they create takalluf, difficulty for themselves and for others, especially for new Muslims and children. A new Muslim is supposed to start with the most important elements of the prayer, learn the Fatiha, learn the Tashahhud. Those are important, the Takbiratul Ihram, without which their prayer wouldn't be valid. But they shouldn't be spending time learning that which is not even Sunnah, but just an additional element of assistance, such as the formulae of the niyyah. So they shouldn't be spending time stressing out about nawaitu and all of these things. They should straightforward get into the prayer with the elements of the niyyah that we just described, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Again, we have the text from Safinat Al-Naja, or rather Nailur Raja, the sharh of Safinat Al-Naja for those students who are registered, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And that brings us to the end of this lesson, lesson in which we discussed the 17 arkan or integrals of the prayer, the optimal way of praying, and the degrees of intention. I leave you with a question. The question reads, what if one prays Isha Salah? What if one prays Isha Salah and then you utter Isha and verbalizing the intention, but thought in your heart that it was Maghrib Salah? So you in your heart you were praying Maghrib. In reality, you were supposed to be praying Isha, and in reality you uttered the words Isha. Is this valid or is this invalid, and why? You should be able to answer that question because we had gone through this a few times now. But to ensure that you've understood the contents of this lesson, again, make sure that you fulfill the multiple choice question, which is part of your course registration. If you haven't registered for the course yet, please do so at seekersguidance.org. This is Imam al-Hadrami's Safinat Al-Naja, and this was lesson number 10. So you can catch up to the other lessons if you missed them, and also have access to those multiple choice questions, which are a way for you to assess your knowledge of the prayer. Until next time, inshallah, Jazakumullahu khairan for joining us for lesson number 10. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.